It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the second of our series of events done in conjunction with UConn Reads here at the Humanities Institute of the University of Connecticut. I'm Michael Lynch. I'm the director of the Institute, and I am very happy to be introducing the moderator of our panel today. But first, a word about our series of events with UConn Reads. This year, the university is reading Amitav Ghosh's The Great Derangement. And in that book, which concerns very much the crisis of climate change, we have organized a series of panels to reflect the human concerns that surround and very much, I think, drive the most pressing issues in climate change research. We're particularly interested in questions of climate justice. And so it's with great pleasure that I am introducing this panel today. Our moderator is Professor Sandy Grande. Professor Grande is professor of political science and Native American and Indigenous studies here at the University of Connecticut, with affiliations in American studies, my own department, philosophy, and race, ethnicity, and politics program. Professor Grande has been on the forefront of thinking about issues that collate around critical theory and Native American and Indigenous studies for the last several decades. She's been a Ford Foundation Senior Fellow, and her book, her classic book, Red Pedagogy, is coming out, or has been actually published in a 10th anniversary edition. I'm really delighted that Professor Grande is here to moderate this spectacular panel. And without further ado, I welcome Professor Grande to this virtual stage. Take it away.
Thank you, Michael, for that lovely introduction. Ayanchu Winastardis Switi Sandy Grande, identify as a Quechua national and coming at you live and direct from Manhattan, which is the land of the Lenape peoples. I would just add, which is apropos for this panel, the REP program, or Race Ethnicity program, has recently been changed to IREP, which is Indigeneity, Race and Ethnicity program. And then I'm also affiliated with the Women and Gender Studies program. So as Michael said, I'm really looking forward today. I've been looking forward to this panel for months. You're all in for quite a treat today. These are three of the most badass Native women I know. And if any of you know Native women, that's really saying something. So I'll just introduce each of the speakers and then give you some sense of where we're going to enter the conversation today on climate justice. And then hopefully we will have more or less of a free-flowing conversation. So Melanie Yazzie is a Diné scholar and an amazing relative of all peoples and nations. She's an assistant professor of Native American Studies and American Studies at the University of New Mexico. She specializes in Navajo and American Indian history, political ecology, Indigenous feminisms, queer Indigenous studies, and theories of policing in the state. She also organizes with the Red Nation, a grassroots Native-run organization committed to the liberation of Indigenous peoples from colonialism and capitalism. Ann Spice is a Tlingit member of the Kwanlindun First Nation, a queer Indigenous feminist and anti-colonial organizer. She's acting assistant professor of geography and environmental studies at Ryerson University, and a PhD candidate in anthropology at the CUNY Graduate Center. Her work is in the tradition of feminist activist ethnography and supports Indigenous land defense against settler state and extractive industry invasion. Her writing's been published in Environment and Society, Jacobin, The New Inquiry, and Asparagus Magazine. And finally, Emily Johnson is an artist who makes body-based work. She's a land and water protector and an activist for justice, sovereignty, and well-being. A Bessie Award-winning choreographer, Guggenheim Fellow, and recipient of the Doris Duke Artist Award. She's also based in Lenapehoking, which is New York City, She is of the Yup'ik Nation, and since 1998 has created work that considers the experience of sensing and seeing performance. Her dance functions as portals and care processions. They engage audience-ship within and through space, time, and environment. She's trying to make a world where performance is part of life. So that's who we have gathered with us today. And I'll just read the short description because I think it encapsulates how we together sort of conceptualize this conversation. And that is, we want to start by saying we don't actually have a climate crisis. What we're experiencing is the centuries-long consequences of settler colonialism and racial capitalism. Indigenous scholars and artists, us on this panel, will discuss the impact of climate change on Indigenous communities, our own experiences on the front line of struggle, and the ways in which our work aims to heighten awareness of these issues. Also, in a time when the dominant patterns of beliefs and practice are being widely recognized as intricately related to the interconnected crises of our time, we will center Indigenous knowledges as competing, legitimate, and vital ways of being in the world and living in good relation. So I'll just start by saying, sort of underscoring why we will be talking about issues related to climate justice today. We'll also just be talking about life as Indigenous peoples because it's all related. It sort of reminds you of the story of my book, Red Pedagogy, when I first, it was actually proposed as to be my dissertation, which got summarily rejected by my committee. And because it begins with a chapter on governance, then moves to land, then moves to a chapter on gender, then moves to a chapter on pedagogy. And I remember one of my committee members saying, well, it seems pretty interesting, but you're really going to have to focus. Like, is this about governance, or is it about land, or is it about gender, or is it about pedagogy? And it's like, I knew in that moment that I would probably never get to a point to explain why those things, you can't talk about one of those things without the other, and how they're just radically interconnected. So all of that is to say that we all every day negotiate settler colonialism on many fronts, in the streets, on our lands, on our bodies, and in cultural and academic institutions, because it's in the air that we breathe, or in Kristen Simmons, as she talks about settler atmospherics. So with that, I'm going to start with just, and the other way I sort of imagine in our kind of pre-conversations is we're all going to, I'm going to invite them to talk about their work. And then there's certainly challenges and struggles in doing our work. And then we're going to think about what is then our collective set of demands. And so we'll start with just getting a sense of the work. So I'm going to turn to you first, Melanie.
So I want to thank Sandy for inviting us to be on this panel. Red Pedagogy changed my life the first time I read it. It's really a foundational text in Indigenous feminism. I think all Native women doing frontline work, and those of us who are doing frontline work in the classroom, those of us who are teaching folks, that's also a type of frontline, have really learned immensely from Sandy's work. And you're just kind of like a legend in the field, and I think in the political work. So when you asked me to be on this panel, I was like, hell yeah, I'll definitely do that. So yeah, I wasn't really sure where to start to talk about the work that I do on climate justice, because I would actually argue that all of the work I do is on climate justice, but I think I'll just talk about it from the perspective of the Red Nation. In the introduction that you did for me, Sandy, right, you just mentioned really briefly what the Red Nation is. I would encourage everyone to go to the link to kind of look at the website and to understand a bit more thoroughly what we do. But the Red Nation started in 2014. It was myself and just a handful of other mostly Native people based in Albuquerque, Tewa Territory, otherwise known as Albuquerque, New Mexico. What was happening in 2014 was a really vibrant anti-police brutality movement after Albuquerque Police Department gunned down a man having a mental health episode, an unsheltered man in the East Foothills of the city. What was also happening at that time is that summer, several Native people were murdered from vigilante violence in Albuquerque on the west side of the city. And so I was a PhD student at the time at the University of New Mexico in American Studies. And along with some other faculty and graduate students, again, mostly Native folks, we started to think about like, why why is it that this violence against Native people, against unsheltered and working class people is so extreme? And so we started to come up with this notion of border town violence, because places like Albuquerque are actually surrounded by Native land. Of course, we are all on Indigenous land, stolen, unceded, or stolen through the abrogation of treaties, et cetera, right? So I think it's important to understand that we're all on Indigenous land. But a place like Albuquerque and a place like New Mexico, where there's a lot of Native trust land, there's a lot of reservation lands, there's a lot of pueblos, you literally are right next door to what would jurisdictionally be considered Native land and actual Indigenous nations, and Albuquerque is no different. And so we were thinking about how there are really high numbers of Native people in places like Albuquerque, which isn't normally thought of as an Indigenous city. It's thought of as a settler city, right? Albuquerque is just thought of as another kind of metropolitan area that belongs to the jurisdiction of the United States. But in fact, in these kinds of spaces, which are colloquially known as border towns, Native people understand them in the United States as border towns because they border our reservations, right, and trust lands in our nations, that we experience really high levels of violence in these spaces because the kind of mandate of settler colonialism, right, is that we're not supposed to be here anymore, that we're supposed to be constantly disappearing, or that we're supposed to be eliminated, or that we're supposed to be sort of quarantined and cordoned off into reservation spaces. And so when we come into these kinds of spaces like Albuquerque, we are seen as out of place, right? We are seen as a threat. We're seen as an anomaly within kind of the larger narrative that the settler fantasy, right, that Native people are no longer here anymore. And then when we do show up, we're not supposed to speak. You know, we're supposed to be seen, not heard. We're supposed to be extremely obedient. And so those of us who live on the streets, those of us who engage in protest, right, those of us who refuse to be silent are, you know, pretty much just treated as a threat in these kinds of spaces. And so you have an entire kind of structure in border towns that silences Native people, whether police participate in it, citizens themselves participate in it. There's a reason why vigilante violence, i.e. just normal settler citizens, rolling Indians, killing Indians, kidnapping Native people, right, harassing Native people on a regular basis, the types of institutional discrimination that we face in these kinds of spaces, the whole kind of structure of violence is extreme, right, because our high numbers in these spaces, because they're close to our nations, means that we're a problem that always needs to be solved. And so there's an entire kind of infrastructure around solving that problem. So it's just a continuation of genocide, right? And so we started to develop this work, and we have a book coming out. I'll try to provide the link after I'm done talking, because I can't do two things at once. To our book, it's coming out with PM Press in May, about border town violence. It's called Red Nation Rising: From Border Town Violence to Border Town to Native Liberation. Kind of charting some of the work we've been doing on this. So what is border town violence, and what do these dynamics have to do with climate justice, right? Well, they have everything to do with climate justice, because the larger, you know, I just finished reading, I'm teaching a Native activism class this semester, and we just finished reading Red Women Rising, which is a report that came out of Vancouver's downtown east side, a report that talks about how missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls really started out of that community. And it was, you know, Native women living on the streets who were being abducted, right, disappeared, kidnapped, and murdered in that community and that particular space, who really helped to drive what we now understand as MMIWG. And the dynamics and the level of violence that they faced, and that report really demonstrates, is actually exactly the same as what we were finding in border towns, places like Albuquerque and Gallup here in the US. And, you know, the MMIWG movement has everything to do with resource extraction, right? The way that Native women are driven off of the land and into spaces like urban, quote unquote, urban spaces or border town spaces like Albuquerque, right? Because the resource extraction is a type of violence against the land that constantly reinforces this idea that Native people, you know, should be disappearing, that we don't have rights to live on the land, that we don't have, the land doesn't, you know, actually belong to Indigenous nations. It belongs to the whims of settler corporations and settler society to do whatever type of development projects that they wish to do, right? And that there's a particular way in which Native women are targeted in that project. It targets the land, but because traditionally Native women are the caretakers of the land, right? We carry a lot of the knowledge of seeds, for example, of planting, a lot of the knowledge, the medicine knowledge that's really instrumental to, you know, Indigenous forms of healthcare traditionally, right? And then also many of our nations, Indigenous women held very prominent customary leadership roles, whether it was through clans, at the head of clans, or the head of kinship networks, or even political leadership, right? And so there's a specific way that resource extraction targets Native women, right? And to clear Native women off of the land, right? To get access to the land. And then physically, where do those women go? A lot of them die, right? A lot of them die. But a lot of them go into these border town, what I would call and argue as a border town space. I'm not sure the Native women who live in Vancouver's downtown east side would call that a border town space, right? And so then we're subjected to even more amounts of kind of social violence and political violence in those spaces. But the whole system, right, operates and targets Native women and Native women's lives and futures specifically to allow kind of this larger extractivist project that settler states, at least Canada owns the most like extractive corporations globally, right? So we need to understand Canada's not the kinder version. Canada's extremely violent extractivist settler empire in the same ways that the United States is, right? And so these two settler societies really depend upon the revenues that they get from resource extraction that then again require the removal and sort of the constant dehumanization and devaluation of Native women's lives. Of course, you know, women, at least cis women, reproduce the nation quite literally, right? So we actually create the future water protectors and land defenders, medicine keepers and knowledge keepers of our nations. And so that's another reason, right, why Native women are the most targeted. You'll see kind of across the board statistically that Native women face the highest rates of violence in both Canada and the United States. And the larger structure, right, of settler colonialism, I think explains, right, why that happens. And so it's not a coincidence that you see MMIWG being attached to land and water defense historically, especially over the last 10 to 20 years in North America and Canada and the United States. And so when I say that what we're talking about, kind of the violence that Native women experience in places like Vancouver, Albuquerque, has everything to do with climate justice, there's a reason why you see Native women on the front lines of pretty much all of the major Indigenous climate justice movements or uprisings or struggles, especially over the last 10 to 15 years, right? It's because we have the most to lose. We have the most on the line. There's the most at stake for us because we understand, right, that protecting the future, protecting the land and the water for future generations is like our responsibility historically, politically, right, and legally according to Indigenous custom. And that's why you see like Native women being such fierce, badass Indigenous land and treaty defenders, right? So it's like what I'm trying to do is paint a picture of why we need to understand when we're thinking about climate justice, we need to understand that it's extremely gendered from an Indigenous perspective, that it has to do with elevating and centering the voices of Native women, especially poor and working class Native women, that frontline isn't just something that's like out on the land, you know, the way that we think like, oh, and Indian people are like one with nature, you know, and those types of things, but that those front lines are also here in the so-called city, right? And that there's a very fluid relationship when we're thinking about the type of front lines that Native women are on. And so the work that you do, let's say to support unsheltered populations or Native women trying to leave the sex trade, for example, just like the survival work that Native women have to do on a daily basis in these kinds of spaces, or anti-police brutality work, right? Trying to stop police violence against Native people. Those are climate justice struggles. Mm-hmm. And that Native women are at the head of those particular struggles because it's all connected. I feel like I've been talking for a while, so I'll stop. I have a lot more to say, but I really look forward to hearing what Emily and Anne have to say and just being in conversation with y'all.
Yeah, I mean, this is really, you know, I invite all of y'all to keep yourselves unmuted if that's comfortable, if you're somewhere quiet, to just like jump in, because I do want this to evolve in some ways as a conversation. And it's not a happenstance that I assembled you as women, all of you doing different kinds of work in the struggle. It was important for me to have this panel be all women for the reasons that Melanie talks about. And one of the things I kept thinking as you're talking, Melanie, is absolutely about how I do think some of the violence that gets or the perceived to be incited by the work that we do, because I do think there's a sense, especially when you're talking about Native peoples, Indigenous peoples, and climate, that it is going to be some conversation about like spirituality and the land, and I don't even know what else. And it's like, actually we want to talk about anti-capitalism, anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, because that's
land back.
And it always reminds me of Elizabeth Cook Lynn, one of the original Native women badasses, who's like, you know, in writing literature and saying how all the publishing houses were interested in like her story and her autobiography. And she was like, everybody wants to hear about the native story, or I don't even know what, we make great baskets. There's no question that we make great baskets, but like, and that's important, and blankets and stuff, but, you know, and tell interesting stories, I guess, and our storytellers to some degree, but, you know, she's like, nobody really wants to hear about from the Indian who wants to talk about capitalism and colonialism.
Yep.
And imperialism. So
Or
that is what we're
treaties.
here to talk. Yeah, your land back. So that's why we're here to talk about today. And I know we all engage that work really differently. And maybe it's a good segue, Emily, since I mentioned sort of cultural institutions and kind of what people perceive as cultural artifacts, to invite you to talk a bit about your work.
Yeah, thank you. It's just so amazing to be here in this little group with these incredible women. I'm really honored, and also like couldn't sleep last night because like I was so excited, and then also I kind of just want to sit here and listen. And I also kind of like, I know that there's some audience out there somewhere, but like, I kind of just want it to be us so we can just like keep doing this work together. But I also know that you kind of, you know, witnessing, viewing also brings a certain focus to this conversation. So I also thank you for being here. I'm in a rehearsal studio actually, and just finished a rehearsal where the dancers and I were thinking about centering love's forces and wielding justice in consensual acts of change, and trying to think of like cellularly, how do we embody that, and what does that mean, and how can a body do that, and how can our bodies teach us that. As Sandy said, I belong to the Yupik Nation. I grew up on Dena'ina land up in what is called Alaska, and I'm here now on the Lower East Side of Mannahatta in Lenape-Ho-King, where I've lived for a few years. And in relation to living here, and in my creative work, and in my work with organizations and institutions, which is intertwined and intermeshed in all kinds of ways, I've learned from and with Lenape folks and kin, and I'm working to create and think of and actuate pathways for Lenape diasporic nations and people to return home as they want to, wish to, desire to. So thinking through that in terms of making dance, and also in terms of decolonizing organizations. I am a dance maker. I think of making large social gatherings. I think of performance as offering, and I effort to, through dance making, build relations between us humans who gather, and also with and amongst our more than human kin, and also with and amongst the land and aqueous and celestial places that we are gathered in and on. With my dear sister and brilliant friend, Karen Recollet, we've been thinking lately about like articulating processual gatherings of care, like tentacular processions of care that actually never end. And we've also been thinking through speculative architecture in relation to a particular work, thinking about how a performance moment, how a performed moment can offer enough support, like an architecture support, whether that's structural, conceptual, spiritual, physical, like systems, how a speculative architecture can support community self-determined processes forward from a performance moment. So we've been dreaming and thinking about this together. And I'm going to share a few photos and kind of describe them. And maybe through that, we'll share a little bit more about this work and what it feels like and what it hopefully invites. So this photo that's up here is, it's a gathering of, I think maybe there's 20 people in the photo or so. They seem to be from all different places. There seem to be a variety of ages. Some backs are turned to us. Some people are dishing out food. Some people are in the midst of eating and drinking. So you can see faces, but there's no one singular attention. There's an attention in a multitude of spaces. There are trees around, and you can see some structural buildings or maybe a bridge in the back. This is a photo from a morning from a performance called Then a Cunning Voice and a Night We Spend Gazing at Stars that goes from sundown to sunrise overnight with an audience who has gathered. This happens to be along a body of water where the Bronx Kill meets the East River here in Manhattan. We don't sleep through this evening together, through the performance, through the stories, through the food that we make together, through the food that we share together, and through a conversation that happens about 3 a.m. related to relations to land and land back. We try to build a process together wherein which in the morning, when we then all disperse, we carry with us the relationships that have started to build, the processes that have started to build, the questions maybe that have started to raise, and really the actual beingness of being on the land overnight together. The second photo here is from the Far Rockaways here, also in Manhattan, in Lenapehoking. This is also from a performance. This is from a performance called Shore. In this photo, it's a sand dune that you can see, but it's kind of, it's not very high. There's like a little bit of rise in the sand, but there are also some shallows in the sand. And there's a boardwalk in the distance. And there's a lot of people, I don't know, 75 people or something, kneeling, squatting, digging in the dirt, some planting trees. There's a lot of hands on the ground in the sand. There's some people like pulling wagons and standing and talking, and there's just a lot of activity and task. This to me is choreography. I love this kind of movement. And to me, you know, what we were doing here on the dunes was planting native trees and shrubs because this dune had been hit by Hurricane Sandy and needed the plants, needed the roots to reroot and rebuild the dune back. And so for months I worked with an organization in the Rockaways to build this day together. And to me, this action is real, right? Planting, protecting this dune. Those are real actions. To me, also dance is a real action. So the next photo is from the stage because, as I forget who mentioned it, because I have to show you that I also, you know, as an Indigenous choreographer, you know, some might put onto me thinking or an assumption that I work only outdoors and only with nature and only with trees. So this is me on stage with some other dancers. This is part of that project though that we just saw at the dunes. You could come plant at the dunes, you could come to the stage, you could come to another day of feasting at Newtown Creek, you could come to a day of storytelling. Each of these events were separated in time, but all part of this performance practice, this thought that that action, that performance, that care giving and care receiving is part of an ongoing process of protection, of care, of attention, of relationship. In this photo, I'm wearing a yellow jumpsuit. I'm taking like a unison type step with a child who's next to me. Both of our hair is pulled back, his is in a braid. There are 3 other dancers and kind of 2 of them in an intimate sphere and 1 kind of walking past. The next photo is just to talk about invitation for a brief moment. Invitation to different forms of gathering, to ethical witnessing. There's this stomp movement that I've been thinking of that is, and doing, that is obviously like a relationship with ground, a resonance with ground. I'm a very ground-based choreographer, but then also to me, the stomp is not about the land, it's about the lift. And so in that little lift after a stomp, what is that possibility? And how does that possibility invite, as Ashan Crawley says, an otherwise possibility? And part of that too is labor, right? I mean, the labor of dance making, the labor of protection, the labor that I expect and invite from an audience, and also the labor that I expect and invite from our cultural institutions in terms of their structure changes, their systems changes, and their decolonization processes. Which brings me to photo number 4. very much related to what we've already been talking about. This is a solidarity effort happening right now, in solidarity with me, actually, in response to harmful and violent behavior, harmful and violent silencing of me, harmful and violent entrenchment of a particular institution into its white supremacist roots and values. And really its abuse of power. And I share it here just because I think that the calls to action, if you find this solidarity statement that was written by a consortium of arts workers, the calls to action in here really are a generative and a powerful path forward in relation not only to this one institution, but to all settler-run institutions, because all of our cultural institutions, our higher ed, our government, our nonprofit, our for-profit, are extractive industries, as Melanie was speaking of. And this extraction is rooted in a colonial logics. So someday, I think that the civil rights and the sovereignty of Indigenous people will be recognized in relation to land, and that the theft of and abuses on and extraction from and lack of recognition of Indigenous land and water will not be tolerated. The land protection efforts are happening everywhere all the time, mostly led, as has already been said, by Indigenous women and femmes, and there's a reason for that. And all of the land protection efforts are not all big name, right? From where I am positioned here in my neighborhood, there are a multitude. There is a community group trying to save this park, East River Park, 57 acres, 1,000 trees that's going to be bulldozed and demolished. I could talk for ages about that. There's Stand with Shinnecock, there's FRAC out of Brooklyn. There's also relatedly community organizations who are fighting the rezoning and gentrification of their neighborhoods in Gowanus, on Governor's Island, in the neighborhoods north and south of Houston, all over, right? All 5 boroughs of New York City. And of course, this is happening in all of the cities across in what is called the United States. And when I think through the rampant destruction of our neighborhoods for profit, and when we fight gentrification as it relates to ending capitalism, refusing environmental racism, refusing the settler colonial process, this is decolonization in a multitude of forms. Which brings me just very briefly back to the cultural institutions and the higher ed institutions, which, if they continue to exist and rely upon an extractive ethic and the harm and the violence of extraction, then they teach and they make possible continued extraction. And so thinking how our cultural institutions, our higher ed institutions can be brought into this process, because I think they're a vital part of a cultural shift and cultural change. I'll pause there.
Wow. Thank you so much, Emily. I love your work so much, and really knits together, and it makes me think about all kinds of things, but kind of the way in which the notion of choreograph, I'm just thinking in a really different way. I mean, Melanie, I can't remember if I knew you before Standing Rock, but we certainly got to know each other there a bit. But I'm thinking of I mean, it wasn't a choreographed space, right? But there was all these different things happening, and I'm wondering, what thinking too about those spaces where you have labor and you have things, these different sort of sites, and thinking about that as a kind of, not a performance, because it was very real. I mean, I think some people came thinking it was a performance. We know who they are, but there's a reason why it was like a prayer camp, and not a protest. But what is the kind of choreographing that goes on in those kinds of spaces as well, is one of the things I'm thinking about. Maybe I'll stop there because I'm thinking of other stuff, but I don't know, Melanie and Anne, curious what your thoughts were, because you've been in those spaces as well.
And I think there certainly is a choreography that's going on, and there's also like a violent, awful choreography that's happening on the side of the police and industry. And there's something there that we're fighting, but also matching in our capacity to actually be organized, sometimes like really literally with our bodies in space. So the politics and the aesthetics and the actual actions that are built up around blockades in particular are very much a choreography. It's very spatial. It's about figuring out where there are access points and choke points. It's about thinking about the spatiality of the enemy that we're fighting, and how they move. And it's, I think we're working, if you go back a step before that, like when we're talking about resource extraction, there's a real sort of space and aesthetics around that as well. I've been thinking a lot about pipelines, because I always am thinking about pipelines, but what the space and the temporality are around like pipeline construction, that's meant to take resources, extract them from the land. In the case of the pipelines that I've been fighting through, hydraulic fracturing, and then transport it linearly through Indigenous territories to export in ports. And what I've learned in the last year, especially as other parts of life were slowing down because of the pandemic and people had to reorganize social relations because of the pandemic, is that sort of linear temporality, that like it's going from one place to another place and it's going along one line into the future, was accelerated through pipeline construction, even as the rest of the world was slowing. Pipeline construction was amping up, and they accelerated through the pandemic crisis to try and get that oil and gas to market. So I think that there's something in that we need to be thinking about how we disrupt that spatially, and how we disrupt that temporally. When we first started organizing against the injunction that was placed on land defenders at Unistoten camp on Wet'suwet'en territory in northern so-called British Columbia, the catchphrase that was going along with our organizing was "the time is now," which was sometimes hilarious because it was just like always now, like it's like, what time is it? It's just now. It's now all the time. But I think that there was an urgency to what we were doing at that point in time. And I think sometimes that's true, that people need to act immediately, but sometimes I think that we need a longer vision. And we need to think beyond this like linear, this like literal line, this pipeline that is trying to draw us into a really particular kind of future. One in which, the pipeline companies, the resource extraction companies are going to be accelerating the effects of climate change while building buffers of wealth for themselves to help protect against the effects of climate change. One in which everything is talked about in terms of the construction schedule and the timeline and how these things need to be happening immediately for the next thing in the linear line to come into place. And I keep thinking about sort of these loops that we need to be like looping back and forward to try and think about what it means to be disrupting that way of thinking that says we just need to, we're going to chop the project up into these little pieces. We just have to do one after the other, and then we'll have a pipeline and everything will be fine. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot about that and the choreography, I guess, required to make those kinds of interventions and to disrupt that way of thinking, because it leads to our destruction. And but it's really hard to break people out of it, because everyone who's working on that pipeline, and even the police who are coming in to enforce the injunctions and to arrest people who are standing in the way of pipeline construction, they see the little segment that they're in, the little moment in time. They're just clearing trees. They don't see themselves as like ushering in some devastating future. But I think that's where especially Indigenous people and the people who are engaged in these land defense movements are helping to kind of take a bigger picture to say it's not just about a pipeline. It's actually not about the pipeline at all. It's about our ability to be living as Indigenous people on our territories and to be engaging in the cultural practices that are survival practices for us in a changing climate. That it's a crucial thing that we are able to access the medicines and the foods that are on our territories. And that it's also crucial that we're building the relations possible to exist in those spaces and to pull ourselves out of the spaces we've been contained in on the reservations, and to be able to do that in community. And it's a dangerous alternative to the current system of destructive racial capitalism. It's that and I think that's why we get so much pushback. That's why just defending the land defense itself is criminalized, a criminal act. And they, if it's not already criminal, they find a way to make it so, which is what the injunctions have done. And so at that point, it's trying to shut down the alternative of what we're offering, which is also an escape route from the absolute climate apocalypse that we're facing, is to really think about how we're building other alternatives that don't rely on these supply chains and the systems that have brought us to this point in the first place.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm thinking a lot about how we do that in space, but it also has everything to do with the state and the police. And I think we need to be making those connections really clearly to say, the police are causing climate change because they're arresting us for protecting the land. So they're responsible, for this. So this is how these things tie together. It's not, you can't separate the environmental movement from our movements for Indigenous justice and liberation.
No, not at all. I love the way this conversation is really pushing me to think about time, space, and movement so differently, in ways that are really helpful and generative, and how there's ways in which those are conceptualized in really destructive ways, and then Indigenous peoples and kin and allies trying to reconstruct that and kind of continue to enact traditional ways that are really wholly against that. And also makes me think, I love that connection between the police and climate change, because it's really intense. I don't know if it's still there, Emily. I don't know if there was a climate clock that they installed, the two artists, and I think it was, last I looked, was 6 years and something, but it's the ticking of, I think it's clocking the point at which the temperature of the earth reached is an irrecoverable moment. And it's really intense when that's ticking down. And then what's happening to people's on the ground and every day. I love the time is now, it's always now. And I love there's always these eruptions of things like, Standing Rock, what would happen. And it's so, there's always something, and that gets the attention, but it's really all the time, every day, everywhere. And yet there's still this bracketing and marginalization and destruction and attempted elimination at Indigenous knowledge, or trying to keep us in that space of museums or cultural artifacts or spiritual practices, and kind of deny a real kind of disavowal of how, not that any of that is unimportant, but the land defense encompasses so many other things. And Melanie, I'm curious to bring you into this conversation too with your experiences, but the other part of movement I kept thinking about is how much you have to be attentive, and we've all been attentive in different spaces of when the trucks are moving, where they're moving, how they're moving, when the cop carts start lining up, and where they're it's you're attentive to all this stuff all the time, of that kind of movement. And so that's a different kind of movement that I kept thinking about as you guys were talking.
Yeah, I really appreciate the framework of choreography, or not a framework, but the reality that what we're doing every day when we're caretaking the land or we're protesting, or, you know, it's a form of choreography. And that choreography isn't just like an individual body moving through space. It's a relationality, right? As you said, because it's choreography, it's different living beings, it's different beings moving together in different ways, sometimes to produce things, sometimes not. So the cops choreograph they have an interesting choreography that you always need to account for when you're engaged in frontline actions. But it's kind of like a dance, actually, in a way, now that I think about it. When you're like on a front line and you're like, here's a move, and we're doing the counter move, and like we're going here, and then they're going there.
It really is.
You know, you're just trying your best. You're literally trying your best to like tactical moves in those kinds of scenarios are definitely types of choreography. Sometimes they're deeply planned and other times they're spontaneous, or they're usually a combination of the two. But then also like the non-spectacular types of, you know, water protection and land defense, or just like being Indigenous, you know, when you are taking medicines and giving offerings, right? Or when even in ceremonial spaces, right? There's like a really, there's an important choreography in those spaces. And so just thinking about, you know, the nature of how Indigenous people go about the world as a dance and through choreography is really beautiful, and also like politically really profound to me. So I really appreciate you sharing that. That said, like, you know, what Anne, you were saying about temporality, I'm like, isn't it Mashana Goman in, oh God, what's her book? Mashana Goman's a really, also another, yeah, Mark My Words. In Mark My Words, Mashana, who's a really incredible Haudenosaunee feminist, talks about temporality as relationality as well in that book, right? So choreography is about relationality, but also like in Indigenous culture, it's not actually about moving through what we understand as time, but it's about relationships, and that we understand time through movement as relationship, right? And so kind of reconstituting or reconfiguring our notion of temporality. And that, you know, for us in the Red Nation, when we think about like Indigenous time, right? It's not linear at all. Like when you think about like Indigenous futurism, for example, which is really central, I think, to all political projects or projects for decolonization, because we have the ticking clock that tells us that we have no future. We don't make changes now, right? This notion of the now that Anne was talking about. But that for Indigenous people, like the future is really just a return to our humanity and to who we are. And so it's not like, it's not linear at all. It's just a like remembering who we are. That's literally what decolonization, right? Is literally what kind of the political goal of kind of an Indigenous approach to climate apocalypse would be. It's like returning to our humanity, which would require us to simply be in good relation with all of one's relations, right? And that is the futurism that we're advocating for, right? And so it helps me to think about, you know, like what are the different terms when you're thinking about something like climate justice from an Indigenous perspective, and thinking about it through choreography and temporality. I think it just kind of leads us back to the heart of the matter, where, you know, tradition, notions of tradition, and the things that Indigenous people do culturally out on the land, whether it's hunting or medicine gathering or songs, you know, or canoeing, you know, I don't come from a water-based people, I'm afraid of water. Or like going up into mountains, you know, and horseback riding and doing those kinds of things, that it's not like we don't know what we should be doing, you know. Indigenous people know what we should be doing and what we haven't been doing. And so the future is like what we should be doing, you know, and we don't really have a lot of time to do it. And so, yeah, those are just some of my thoughts. Those are open-ended.
It's what we should be doing, and then also like fighting to just be able to do that, you know, because
yeah, exactly.
Everything like that tries to prevent you from doing that. It makes me, and I like thinking too about how so much of our traditional spaces are choreographed, and it made me think kind of a funny story of, it was one of our traditional feasts, which was like kind of a very long process until you finally get to the point where you're gonna, you know, share food together. And we were hosting some, I'll just say non-Indigenous peoples from away. And so everybody was like really tired and hungry. I mean, I think we had been up the whole night before, you know, praying, whatever. And then at the same time, like this beautiful, you know, lamb and pig were roasting over an open, like, and so like, everybody was just starving and it was gorgeous food. And so one of the elder women went to the, everybody was assembled in like this traditional, like stone architectural thing that's like a circle. And was speaking in Quechua, so most people couldn't, or the guests couldn't understand what she was saying. But we can be long-winded, so she was like talking and talking, and then she like asked my help to like invite them over, and then she invited them over, and she's standing in front of like this gorgeous pig that had been roasting again, open fire all day, and then she handed them, like some of the plates and stuff, and they were so excited because like I think in a non-Indigenous world, it's like those are the guests and they're gonna like start to eat. And then she was like, no, you are serving like all the older people. And I just remember their faces like, no. And they had to serve everybody first. And it was just in the choreography of that, I can still see that moment. It just always makes me laugh. But anyway, kind of bit of a non sequitur, but it does make me think of, as we're doing our various choreographies in everyday life all the time, every second, in our culture institutions and our academic institutions, we haven't even gotten there yet. Like what are the challenges for that? I mean, because it's like we talked before among ourselves about how much of just like being can be so illegible in these spaces, because you're operating in a really different kind of spatiality, temporality. I don't know. So I'm curious about, there's the doing the work and the remembering, but what are the kinds of things that often fetter that work that you guys encounter? I mean, aside from like stuff we talked about, police, people building pipelines. I mean, kind of the more quotidian examples, I guess.
I can offer a story there, and also just to speak of choreography again. There's and we've all been thinking through this. To me, I think about choreography and movement, and I pay very close attention to then what becomes shared via choreography.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, it's the intention within and embedded within the quote choreography. That's what is actually to be paid attention to. And so here's like a massive difference, right, between the intention, the choreography of the feast that you discussed, our processions, our processual protests, our land-based work, everything that we've mentioned, and then the choreography of that linear like front line, or that line of people standing facing you with guns, right? Like the intention behind, like, so like thinking about what is within the choreography, and that brings me to thinking through sometimes within institutions, because the dance work that I make is intertwined with my intention, with my intention toward and in relationality and building that relationality. That means that the organizational partners, the cultural institutions, whomever those partners are part of that process. And so there is no separation between the dance that I make and decolonization processes, systems change processes within a cultural institution that I'm working in. And that's an invitation in, and I have many amazing partners who want to who as settler run spaces want to become different, right, in their value systems, in their ethos, and in their impact on the world. And I invite those kinds of relations. And then there are the ones that enact a strict refusal and want to extract from knowledge, from my practice as an artist, want to extract what they can to portray a solidarity, to perform a solidarity with an Indigenous future, but not actually engage in the decolonization processes. And those places are extraordinarily violent. And so those, and it's you know, being on front lines where you face bullets, where you face water hoses, where you stand and you sing and you continue. It's tricky because it's not a comparison where in which my life isn't that moment threatened, but there is a similar feeling of the violence of extraction and the knowledge that that is the intent, right, of the cultural institution or the person of that cultural institution. And so my understanding of how how my comrades hold a front line or continue in a front line, and the multiple front lines that there are that we've all been discussing, that's what I bring sometimes to those interactions, because I cannot let that extraction continue, because if it does, then it continues for the next person, it continues for the next, and it continues for the next. And also it's just a harm onto my body and onto my and onto everything that I have because of the future I want to be part of, and that is now, and my ancestral future too. That's one challenge that particularly comes to mind.
Yeah, I do feel like every place we're in, they all want to decolonize. And then like, where do you know, which is often misunderstood as like, you know, let's add a book or do this. And it's just like, well, let's start with land, you know, let's start with land back. And then they're like, oh, wait, but not that. That's not what we need. And on some level, I totally agree with you, Emily, like the violence of that misunderstanding or failure to be read, or the illegibility, just the complete, like not being able to comprehend that, or it's dismissed as completely like, well, we can't do that. So then what, you know, well, then you're not really serious, and then they don't want to hear that. So then, you know, then begins the process again of erasure, or kind of violently being dismissed or whatever. I am interested in the kind of more quotidian manifestations of this, as we're all just, you know, trying to make our way through, whether it's the academy or cultural institutions. You know, it just emerges in so many, just about everything is set up to actually not support the development of good relations, which is the title of this panel.
Yeah, I think there's something about how something that's similar about the way that what we are calling frontline spaces and how we need to act in academic spaces or institutional spaces. I think I bring a similar framework to both. Part of what I've learned from the incredible land defenders that have been doing this for literal generations before me is that the way they approach the work of land defense is to act and behave and be on the territory as if it is unceded, as if it is sovereign, and as if you are liberated, and that those are the actions that will lead us to that point for everyone. I mean, the way that Frida Hewson, who's the spokesperson for Una Stoughton, put it is that her advice is to do what your ancestors did. And it sounds really simple when she puts it that way. But it's exactly what she did. You know, she moved back to the territory, she built a cabin, she started growing things, you know, all of the things that, you know, are bringing us back to that way of life. And I think it's a strategic thing as well, and really good strategy to behave as if we actually are the rightful title holders on these territories. You know, we come up against all of the force of the state when that happens, but you know, I think that's really important, is that's the main practice. And when people ask about what the sort of day-to-day on in frontline spaces is like, you know, it's just living. It's just being out and being in relation with the land. And That's not always particularly romantic, and in fact is often not.
It's hard.
It's hard.
Hard work.
It makes me think, like, I just had this insight, because that's the fundamental relation that governs all other relations or conditions and shapes all other relation to land, that there's some, and you're always on land or water. I mean, obviously it's just not the actual material land. And I was thinking about that, and then like the time is now notion, and it's like, so there's always something at stake all the time. And
Yeah.
and kind of living life in a way where there's always something at stake, versus, I don't know, not living in that space. And I encountered that, I think, difference in the academy all the time right now, in a very like related but not related way. I keep thinking of a student of mine who, after reading, was frustrated with the conversation that some of her peers are having in the class, and she's like, I want to know what's at stake. What is at stake here in this reading? And it was so true, because it's just like, you know, so much of what we, I think, endure in the academy especially is like conversations that are disconnected. You know, if we're always trying to connect, there's lots of conversations that are disconnected from something, anything being at stake. Let's say it's not the land. Then what is it? Like, whose life? What life? Community? I don't know, something. But typically it's like, I mean, maybe typically is unfair, but often it's, I don't know what's at stake for folks in the conversation. Like,
yeah. Well, I think making it that clear, like, and trying to locate the stakes for folks is really, it's really important, and it's really hard. I mean, I think about the way that people in anthropology, so I'm trained in anthropology, and don't believe in disciplines or discipline really in an academic sense, but the way that people responded to my dissertation project when Standing Rock started was that this is like a boon for me. This is like, you know, how great that this is coming along, and now your work is so relevant, which just makes me want to punch people in the face. But and so somehow I managed to not do that. But I think that that's the thing, is that they don't realize the stakes, and so we're constantly having to articulate again and again, like, this is life and death for us, and it's not about my individual career.
yeah.
And I write like that as well. Like, I write as if what I'm writing is for our survival, because it is. And if I feel like a lot of the time that's the mode of writing I have, and then on the other side it's like, oh, you wrote a poem. Like, that's, you know, that's what you did. And I was like, no, that's just how I write now, because I can't do otherwise. It feels like, you know, the most urgent voice I have is that voice.
And the stakes of our gatherings too, like that, you know, that in our chat that we had previously, that's what we came to. Like, what are the stakes of us gathering to, like, what do we want to, like, that, I think that's where we came up with that demand language, right? You know, and thinking through the time this year of COVID, when our gatherings have been so affected, when we've been moved into these separate spaces more so, like, thinking through now is that as the relationship with that virus is shifting, what are the stakes of our gatherings, and are they heightened? I hope they're heightened. What are, you know, like, what is the paying attentionness? What is the, like, I love how you speak of that like, what if our gatherings are our survival also? And that's explicit about that somehow.
Yeah, maybe that's a good segue to that.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah, go for it, Melanie.
This is how I act in the academy. I'm just like, no, I'm going to speak. Which is totally normal in a group of Indigenous women, but you get like the side eye when you do it in a space where you're expected to be civil and respectful and polite, like the good Indian that behaves. So everything that you all just said, like stakes, I am sick of trying to explain the stakes to academics. I'm a trained academic. I went to elite institutions. I went to Yale, for my master's degree. Like I know the scam. I know the whole game of this profession. And I am personally really tired of getting invited to elite institutions to talk about the activist work. I don't usually get invited to things to talk about the knowledge production. When you produce theory and knowledge out of the organizing itself, right? That's a type of, it's actually one of the main types of knowledge production, actually, that comes out of what I would consider Indigenous studies. I'm in a Native American studies department. I'm just really exhausted from translating. I'm tired of translating for institutions what's at stake. So I just am really honest. Like when we said this, right, when we were meeting, like I have no filter anymore when I present in different spaces, because like the process of having to like do the genre shift all the time, especially in academic spaces, is I'm just not willing to do it anymore, because they want to throw money at you to kind of like be the activist person on a panel. But then the way that knowledge is translated and consumed and reproduced is like so detached like what you're saying and like the actual reality on the ground. And so I'll read what people, even people like who are considered woke academics, will write about Indigenous struggles. People write about the Red Nation sometimes, and I'll read it. And these are people who I like might actually be friends with in the academy, and I'll be like, dog, you got that wrong. Like you don't understand these politics at all. And it's because like you are invested in a certain way of framing things that reinforces like a kind of gaze, an academic gaze on things. And like I know what that gaze is because I work in this field, so like why aren't you doing the work to undo that and to stop acting that way when you're talking about Indigenous movements? Or like, why don't I see you on the streets sometimes,
Yeah.
Or like, why don't I see you out there feeding people, doing the choreography of resistance that the rest of us do as survival work. It's not just like a thing that we write about, in dissertations and books and stuff. And so, yeah, it's uncomfortable. It's super uncomfortable to be that person in the academy, because you're just like, I don't care about all of these conventions that you think I should care about, because then you get attacked in spaces, you might not get tenure, like there's all of these things that like affect your profession when you're just like, no, I'm not going to do this anymore for you. I'm not going to perform for you anymore. So, but I don't know how else to be. Like,
Exactly.
God tells us we have like 6 years or something, right? So like that's more important to me
Exactly.
than this other stuff.
The other day I was talking, I said in a meeting, unfortunately maybe, but also in conversation, we're like, if you think about like, if you have like, everybody wants to have like these cluster hires and we want Native scholars, but it's again, as an act of sort of consumption in a sense, and extraction often, or accumulation, I don't know what. But then once you get there and then you're that person, it's like there's all this confusion. It's just like, if you think about like as an Indigenous person living in what we now call the United States, or if you're coming from outside to an American into the American Academy, if you think of everything that person had to endure to get to that point and live through and demand and struggle and resist and refuse and fight against and like push the violence off of them, how to be a PhD holding Indigenous person, stamped by the US Academy, you're not having that's not a wallflower in front of you. And then they're so surprised.
A fighter.
And it's like, I literally said that in the meeting the other day. I'm like, listen, I'm here, I got here from being relentless. So I will continue to be relentless, because that's who you hire when you hire. I mean, just FYI. But it's, it's not, I don't mean any whatever. It's not about even disrespecting, because that tends to be like the frame. We go right to the civilizing discourses, which work so well for us. But in any sense, it's just kind of who we are. It's just who we are at this juncture, and it's about embracing it. And, there's always, well, they're like, well, there's consequences. Like there's always, but there's consequences and there's consequences. Like there's like, the award or the committee, or there's like, land and living and air. That's a consequence too for the work that we do. So this is typically the time, and we did talk about this, where we go to a Q&A session, but we talked about being what it's for all of us to be in these spaces, and how extractive that often feels. Like you can give this kind of a talk and the first question is going to be like, I don't know, we've all had the most horrible questions. And so we talked in, I mean, folks can, put stuff in the chat and maybe we'll have a record of that to respond to in different ways should we feel moved. But we talked about and decided together about sort of enacting a kind of form of ethnographic refusal, which is Audra Simpson's work. I mean, it's lots of people's work, but I think she's the signature work in all of this. And she's a Mohawk anthropologist who, in the process of doing her own research, really came to start to theorize what how Indigenous peoples themselves and communities are often subjected to the process of extraction of knowledge or research or whatever it is, or arts. But they decide for themselves what they want to be known. And we've always done that, but how it translates a little differently when you're talking about work related to the academy. And people often see refusal as a negative stance because we're not providing access. And that's never a good thing in a nation that sees itself as defined by access. She talks about it as the revenge of consent, which I really like. And consent is another issue that's huge in Indigenous communities because the government's supposed to get consent, never does. Research supposed to consent, never do. What does consent even mean? And refuse, so it's an enactment of something that's in it. She also talks about, it's not another word for resistant. It's a resistance. It's a much more generative term and space than that. It's really about retaining kind of one's own sovereignty, I guess, but also, protecting the sovereignty of their peoples and communities. So rather than kind of give access to ourselves, which we're going to refuse in this moment, we talked about if each of us had, in the face of all the challenges, like if you have a demand or a kind of instantiation of refusal that you want to share, that would make life better for all of us. I mean, other than land back, that's obviously the first.
Obviously.
Absolutely.
Just do it. Speaking of the sort of like extraction of Q&A, I was in a talk that we talked about this also before we had this open up, that the first question is often like, what can we do?
Yeah.
And someone asked that question and I was like, okay, like, how can you get involved? Well, here's how you get involved. It's like, it is about the return of land. It's about being able to like protect the land without being criminalized. And this white man was like, who starts that? Like, who does it start with? And I was like, you, like, what? This whole time you thought someone else was going to do that? Like, like I almost yelled it because I was just like, this is unreal. I've been like going on and on about like decolonization and this is the work and we're being attacked, and he's just like, all right, so like, who's
the app? What do I do?
Who's gonna lead us into the work? Like,
yeah.
Oh man, it's really bad. But part of it's because I think people have inactive imaginations, and when you say something like land back, they just like cannot possibly imagine what that would look like. Partially because they do not trust us to manage and govern our own territories. And so my first demand is to trust Indigenous people. And that means following Indigenous laws and protocols. It means doing way more than just learning whose territory you're occupying, but actually like doing the work of thinking through and then putting into practice what it would mean to actually live in good relation with the people whose territory you're occupying. Which means like following those protocols. So that's the first one, I would say. The second one that we were talking about a bit before is to abolish the police. I think that this is a point of solidarity between Indigenous peoples, between Black people, all people who are being criminalized in the spaces that we are moving through, and doing that work of imagining beyond this structure, beyond a carceral system, is just so crucially important. And I think it's something that Indigenous people can also be doing to be in better relation with people who we need to be working with as a priority in spaces. And I think that is that sort of future imagination, that is the Indigenous futurity that we were talking about, Indigenous futurisms that we were talking about earlier, needs to include our Black relatives, and we need to be imagining worlds where they're included, and that abolishing the police is like the first step to kind of like getting to that space where we're all being disproportionately incarcerated. And for right now, for the work of defending the land and attempting to slow and mitigate the climate crisis it's really like that's the part of the stakes. Part of the stakes is what is the criminalization of individuals that's happening in our communities. And that's a whole system that needs to go. So figure it out.
So always start, we've got land back, trust Indigenous peoples, and abolish the police on our list so far. I like trust Indigenous people, and it's not even a blind trust, because even in the realm of academic speak and research, I mean, pretty much all the research evidence is that when Indigenous peoples are entrusted with their lands, they're much more well taken care of. Who has demands? Now's your time, Melanie. This is your moment.
Emily, do you want to go? I think clearly my whole life is a demand, but
yeah, right. It's true.
Listen.
Listen to me.
I also love that, and that you began with the trust, and that the calling forth of imagination, because all of the demands / solutions that we put forth absolutely are and will be actionable, and so yeah, confronting refusal, fear, etc. with trust, I think is amazing. I'm adding stop resourcing white supremacist and racist cultural and higher ed institutions with your time, with your knowledge, with your money. Stop attending, stop going there, stop producing knowledge, stop buying tickets, stop paying tuition, stop funding the racist institutions that are remaining entrenched in those white supremacist values, because they continue to pass them on, and also return all of our belongings.
Love that.
Great. So all of that, what you all said, I think, something I didn't mention, I went off on something else when I first started talking on the panel. I was going to talk about something completely different, but the Red Deal, which is this Indigenous vision of climate justice that the Red Nation just published through our own imprint. We started our own imprint, like Indigenous media by and for Indigenous people. It's called Red Media. But at the end of the Red Deal, we say something really similar. We're like, just stop being racist towards Native people. Stop erasing us. Don't try to impose your political agendas onto Indigenous people somehow. We don't want a seat at the table of power, whether it's the power of the ruling class or the power of the left, frankly. I'm a leftist, and as an Indigenous person, I filter my leftist politics through an Indigenous worldview. And, we don't want to be represented. This isn't liberal democracy. It's the ways of the future where you get
or included,
you get other people or included. We don't want that at all. you just take your lead from us. There's a reason why we're the ones on the front lines really like throwing down hard about climate justice all over the global north and the global south, you know? Like Indigenous knowledge isn't, you know, it's not like just like smudging, you know, like just drumming, although those things are important, don't get me wrong. But Indigenous knowledge is like science and technology, you know, like we know like soil conservation, like we know how to divert water and like handle drought and things like that. Like Indigenous knowledge is science. And like, if you're going to think about climate science, then take Native people, Indigenous people seriously. Like we caretake 80% of the biodiversity of the world, like the air that you breathe, you know, what is that like? Thanks to Indigenous people, like you got oxygen, you know, in your lungs. And so like, you know, we don't want just like handouts. We don't want to be incorporated into existing struggles. You can trust us and you can trust our knowledge because we're still here. Is the knowledge that our ancestors gifted us is why we are still here. And when we become the good ancestors of future generations, guess what? It's going to be that knowledge that's going to maintain or going to guarantee a future for life on this planet. And that's why you should trust us, you know? And I'm not really interested anymore in trying to convince people why you should trust us because of that. Like we have a pretty proven track record, I would say, in that regard. And the other thing I would say that's kind of related to like why you should trust Indigenous people is that like what Anne said is exactly what I would say. Follow Indigenous laws. Like we actually have laws that govern our relationships with each other, our relationships with the land and the water, with other than human relatives, the relatives in the stars, right? The relatives underneath the ground. And so those again aren't just like mystical new agey weird things, right? That's not just you get to drum and go to a spring and stuff like that. Those are laws. And there's a reason why there's protocol and laws around how you are expected to be responsible to exist in right relation, right? That's why I think you said that at the beginning of the panel, Sandy, like that's why we're in this situation. It's not a climate crisis. It's people who refuse to follow those laws, actually, I think is why we're in this predicament. And so what I often experience from non-Native people, and this includes non-Native people of color, is that they enter Indigenous spaces, whether they're frontline spaces or even organizations like the Red Nation, sort of like looking to find themselves or kind of expecting to be adopted or expecting, I don't know, that story you told, Sandy, expecting to be our guest, and then somehow Indigenous people will, you know, incorporate you and include you into this. And I mean, like, yeah, that kind of relationality is important and that kind of kinship is important, but the kinship is actually a law. It's not like a playground for you to try to find yourself, like your identity, like coming into a ceremonial space. Like, even if you're invited into those spaces, you know, don't act as if like you have a right to that space, because like we don't even have rights to those spaces, and we respect that because there's a reason, right, why you play a specific role within Indigenous law and Indigenous custom. And so, you know, just have some goddamn respect for Indigenous people. Even if you're coming to Standing Rock, you know, don't sit around and expect to be fed, you know, don't come in trying to find yourself. Like, we're not trying to find ourselves. We know who we are. Like, you should know who you are. Just come in as a good comrade. Just be a good relative. Yeah. And like, we actually recently experienced something in the Red Nation with our own members where a bunch of people left because they were acting that way. And the Indigenous women threw down and they're like, you need to stop acting this way. This is just settler behavior. You can't act this way. This is an organization about and for Indigenous people. And instead of being accountable and working on it, they just walked away from us, you know? And that's actually really common, even in like woke or like even kind of like left organizing spaces. So, you know, just be really mindful of that. Be mindful of like what you're bringing in, and don't offload your anxieties and your like journey onto us, because that's not what this is about.
I think it's a really hard ask too when you come from such a culture where individualism is so revered and cultivated and curated and awarded. You know, it's a really hard ask that I think even people who really want to learn to be or follow protocol to be in good relation, I realize every day how hard it is for folks to unlearn. That other way of being is just really, I don't know what it is. I mean, beyond hegemonic, and toxic. It's clearly like so ingrained. And you know, honestly, because we're in that same, greater society in the academy, it's like something you have to consciously think about all the time to like not fall into that. the
It's
one
hard.
I would add to this, and then I have a little like announcement, I guess, or advertisement, is I would just say, and it's really hard right now, but to care for elders. I mean, multi-generations really, but and elders as a distinctive population of people that are older. But I mean, care for everybody, but I think particularly in this time, care for elders is important to me for multiple reasons. I'm just going to share, there is, in terms of, just wanted to make people aware of something happening now, if you want to get involved now in something. There is something going on, Strike MoMA, which is lots of allies, Native, not all different organizations in the city, and they're calling themselves the International Imagination of Anti-National, Anti-Imperialist Feelings, which I love. And their current action is Strike MoMA, which is really trying to imagine and reimagine the museum as a space beyond what it currently is and has been, which is profoundly colonialist. And their actions are going to start on April 9th, I believe, and go for 10 weeks. And I would just check their stuff out on a website if folks are interested in doing this kind of work in cultural institutions. And I think that's it. We've got 1 minute left, and Michael's back.
Hi, well, I just want to say that was a terrific panel. What a real, that was one of the best conversations I've been privileged to listen to. And I am sure that the audience would agree. Sandy, thank you so much for organizing this. Please, everyone, join me in thanking Professor Grande, Sandy, and all of the panelists for this fantastic conversation. Thank you.
Happy to see you, women, as always.
So much.
That was terrific. Thank you so much.